Thank you. Hi, everyone. So in case you didn't catch that, I'm faculty here at UGA, public service faculty, and I'm also a student. And so I will be talking about some of the work that we've been doing out on Tybee. In the instructions that Nate sent out, he asked us not to share a straightforward description of our projects, but rather to share ideas. An idea of what made our project successful and what aspects of it could be replicated and perhaps adapted for other projects. So to begin, I'm going to take you through a coastal problem and then describe how UGA is helping to address that problem. The overall story that I will be telling is how we partnered with the city of Tybee Island to create a 50-year sea level rise adaptation plan. The first plan of its kind in Georgia. It was unanimously adopted by Tybee City Council in April 2016. Oops. So this is Tybee Island, about 20 minutes east of Savannah, home to roughly 3,000 full-time residents. That is my son. Tybee has a tourism-based economy and is known for its beautiful beaches and vacation rentals. The number of visitors on a busy summer weekend can balloon up to 30,000 people, providing significant benefits to the state and local economy. However, more and more, Tybee Island is becoming known for this, flooding. And this, more flooding. This is Highway US 80, the one road that connects Tybee Island to the mainland, the one road access to the island. This isn't a rain or storm event, but rather what is known as sunny day flooding from a huge naturally occurring king tide. So no storm, this is just a regular event. In measuring tide and sea levels, one mechanism is to look to NOAA tide gauges. Here in Georgia, we have a NOAA tide gauge at Fort Pulaski National Monument, which lies between Savannah and Tybee. 1 year ago, this gauge measured 3 of the top 10 highest tides recorded since 1935 for the Savannah area. All 3 of these occurred over a 1-month period. And then Hurricane Matthew came along. It took the highest water level on record for Fort Pulaski since 1935 and smashed it by over 1.5 feet, even though the hurricane didn't pass at high tide. Oh, I'm sorry. That's the storm surge map. So those are the current conditions. What about the future? Unfortunately for our coastal communities, the frequency of flooding is going to increase. That same tide gauge at Fort Pulaski has measured 9-inch rise in sea level over the past 80 years. And NOAA predicts that this trend is going to very likely accelerate, estimating that global sea levels will rise between 8 inches and 6.6 feet by 2100. And by the way, I just want to point out, this graphic was created by Julie Spivey here at UGA, a graphic design professor. So talking about collaborating with the arts. For our low-lying barrier islands and coastal communities, this creates complex safety, economic, policy, and planning issues. This is Tybee today. How do I get this to? There we go. This is Tybee today, and this is Tybee under 3 feet of sea level rise. However, as my colleague Shauna Jones says here at UGA, the sea level is not just going to suddenly plop to 3 feet. It's going to be a slow and steady creep. We're going to have a king tide event with flooding, and then it'll retreat. We're going to have a storm surge with flooding, and then it'll retreat. And one of the impacts affecting our entire country as this plays out is the increasing burden on the federal government to pay for flood damages when this occurs, and the rising cost of flood insurance being passed on to coastal property owners through recent legislation. So how did we at UGA attempt to address these challenges? I've tried to identify the ingredients that I think made the Tybee Island Sea Level Rise Adaptation Plan so successful, receiving widespread media attention, Sea Grant's National Superior Outreach Award, and being selected as a case study in President Obama's U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. And one of the ingredients is transdisciplinary research. This is a relatively new concept in academia, but you may be hearing about it quite a lot here at UGA because of the Center for Integrative Conservation Research. Having diverse disciplines at the table allowed us to explore the social, economic, and environmental aspects of sea level rise on the island and extend tentacles in many different directions, such as engaging UGA environmental law class through Lori Fowler and the Integrative Conservation PhD program in the project. It created ripple effects in follow-up research and outreach initiatives like building a living shoreline at the Tybee 4-H Center, which is currently being constructed, and the possibility of creating a buyout program for repetitive loss properties, which Scott Pippin is conducting. However, disciplinary research is different than interdisciplinary research in that it requires collaborating with the local community as an equal partner, not an end user of the information, but rather a co-producer of the knowledge. We used a community-driven framework where Tybee Island decided upon the level of risk that it wanted to plan for in determining what rate of sea level rise to use in our models. City Council and residents also determined what areas and issues it wanted us to study in relation to the island's vulnerability and possible adaptation options to consider. We conducted benefit-cost analyses comparing do-nothing approaches to different adaptation scenarios. So I'd like to give you just a few examples of those efforts. One of the things that they asked us to look at is flooding on the southwest side of the island up here. And if any of you are familiar with Tybee, this is AJ's restaurant where you might have had a drink or had a meal. And so they were interested in building a seawall along the southwest end. Our cost-benefit analysis determined that this was not a good investment, and moreover, determined that actually the flooding was not due to water coming over the lip of the island, but coming through the stormwater system. So water was flowing backwards through the stormwater system, coming up through storm drains and flooding yards and streets. So Tybee Island built a tide gate that prevents water from flowing backwards during high tide events. Another thing that we studied is US Highway 80, that one road leading out to the island. And this, let me just make sure that I give you the right stats. So our vulnerability assessment of US Highway 80 indicates that if it is not elevated, it will flood between 50 to 1,250 hours per year, depending on which rate of sea level rise unfolds. And we're working with the Department of Transportation to incorporate that. They are planning to widen the road, and so now we're trying to help them consider whether to also elevate it. So with beach erosion, they're incorporating our study into the reauthorization of the Tybee Island Shoreline Protection Project. They do beach renourishment on Tybee Island. And just yesterday, I was catching up with a colleague. He's a former city councilman on Tybee Island, Paul Wolf, for those of you who know him. And he indicated that during Hurricane Matthew, more damage occurred where there were gaps in the dunes than when there was a continuous dune line. And so now they're doubling down on efforts to try to create a healthy dune field to prevent damage during storm surge events. And finally, there's a program called the FEMA FEMA Community, what is it, CRS? Community Ready System, thank you. That it's a voluntary incentive program that cities and counties can join, and by doing several floodplain management practices, everyone in the community, all property owners, receive a discount in their flood insurance. This has been a great opening point for dialogue with coastal communities because they have an immediate benefit to trying to plan for sea level rise or flooding, and it benefits everyone in the community who's a property owner. And so through that, Tybee Island has improved its rating and is saving quite a bit of money through the CRS program. So this summit is also focused on sustainability, and so I'd just like to talk for a brief moment about what happens when the composition of a city council changes, or a trusted collaborator leaves their position, affecting support for creating initiatives, or your transdisciplinary team finishes its funding and moves on to another location. This has happened in Tybee. One of the recommended actions in the plan was raising the well pump houses. It was a low-cost win-win scenario with a high return on investment. And it was included in the city's budget for 3 years in a row. However, this kept getting pushed aside for other priorities until eventually it was taken out of the budget altogether. So how do you take a 2-year funding cycle and expand those efforts into a living, breathing document? One way to give legs to your project is to partner with UGA Public Service and Outreach. There are 8 different units under Public Service and Outreach, plus cooperative extension on the land grant side, which is really similar. All of which are attuned to building relationships with diverse sectors within Georgia. They have expertise on how decisions are made, and they have a long-term presence in these communities. So even though our funding has ended on Tybee Island, we still have a presence there, and we're continuing to work, and we'll continue to remind them of these decisions that they initially thought were important, but then can get distracted as time goes on. And they also have experience translating academic knowledge into real-world impacts. And then finally, I just want to give a plug for any of you who are interested in doing research in coastal Georgia. We're just about to open our RFP. Should be coming out in just a few weeks. And it's for January 2018 until January 2020. We'd love to, we would welcome proposals from you all, and I've put my contact info there if you have any questions. And thank you so much for having me.